So welcome everyone, and thank you very much for coming. I know there are many people from outside the college. So I'm David Wallace, I'm Master of Churchill College. So just a few words from me, and then I'll hand over to Jan, who's going to say a few things from the Lucy Cavendish perspective. But I've got, firstly, some housekeeping, which is to point out no practice fire alarms are expected. So if one goes off, it's almost certainly for real, and there's an exit here and two at the back. Could I ask you, please, to switch all mobile devices to off? And if I may, not just to silent, because the final thing to say is that we are going to be filming this. I hope that you are all content that this should be filmed, and I know that the speakers have given their permission for that. And probably, since we're recording, even if your phone is on silent, if there's a call, it's quite likely to be heard for posterity as a in the recording device. So please switch off, if you will. So just a few words again before I hand over to Jan. This is the second event in which we are celebrating 40 years of the admission of women into the colleges which were previously all male, and of course the Lucy Cavendish is in a special circumstance which Jan will describe. And the colleges concerned, as far as the all males were concerned, were King's, Clare and Churchill. It's a bit like university league tables. You know, you can always find a league table at which you're top. It turns out that Churchill was the first to take a decision to admit women. King's was the first to announce it. I'm sorry, Volker, I can't say anything about Clare, but also know, of course, that Churchill was the last to be founded as an all-male province. So we're not entirely covered in glory on that. Now, I understand, although I haven't actually looked at them, there are some photographs, I hope this is true, which Michael Smythe has put together of all colleges, I think, 40 years ago associated with the admission of women. From my personal perspective, I'm deeply, deeply conscious of the impact which this change has made. Now, I have to say that it was brought home to me this morning. I was having coffee with the 63 reunion. This was their 50th back in college. And one of them was remarking, when they came back 10 years after their matriculation in 73, of course, there was this huge surprise of women around. But that wasn't the real thing which made an impact on them. They were truly astounded that the men had stopped throwing bits of bread rolls around. So that was one impact of them. But on much more serious, of course, it's been wholly beneficial, surely long overdue. And all I can say is that, gosh, you are a very, very formidable bunch, actually. Hugely added to the life of the college, of course. It just seems such an anachronism now to be talking in those terms. To the life of the college and, of course, to your professions outside. So seriously, very impressive people. Now, I'm looking forward very much, obviously, to this afternoon. I guess I'm going to be sort of anchoring, but at this point, I think I hand over first to Jan, who's going to say a few words from the Lucy Cavendish, and then I think it'll be straight over to you and your panel, and thank you all very much. Thank you. So, Jan.
Thank you. Well, let me add my welcome to what David has said. I've just come from talking about Mr. Darcy over in Sidgwick, and it's about Jane Austen and romance. And it's rather wonderful to come over here and think about all the options other than romance that are now open to women, which were not open to Elizabeth Bennet at the time in 1813. Well, to help make these options happen, Lucy Cavendish College was founded in 1965, and it was Britain's first graduate college for women. In 1972, the university allowed it to take in undergraduates to a maximum of 50 mature women students, over 25. That was what maturity meant then. 20 students aged between 25 and 36 joined the college in the autumn. Among them are teachers People really from all walks of life, and one actress. I think actually a lot of our students are actresses somewhere, but perhaps not always on the stage. The president at that time, Kate Bertram, wrote that they brought a great deal of liveliness to the college and they came from diverse backgrounds and so on. And I think that's absolutely true of our students today, perhaps even more so. Well, this significant development at Lucy Cavendish coincided with what's already been mentioned, the striking development in Cambridge University generally, where Churchill, Clare and King's admitted women undergraduates for the first time. 3 years later, women accounted for a third of the undergraduates in these three colleges. While the process once started was inexorable, ending in 1987 when Magdalen became the last male college to admit women, the pace of change was really only gradual. In 1974, only 17% of undergraduates in Cambridge were women, compared to 12% when there were the three women's colleges in 1960, while the national average was 36%. So it's taking its time. Although in many ways there had been considerable progress since 1972, and certainly since 1948, when women first became eligible for full degrees at Cambridge. I think we forget just how short the time has been. There's still much to be done within the university generally, as only 27% of all academics are women and 16% of professors are women. 1972 was a significant year for women throughout the world. In the UK, Rose Heilbrunn was appointed as the first female judge to sit at the Old Bailey. Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm in America became the first African-American candidate for president of the United States and the first woman to run for the Democratic presidential nomination. Queen Margrethe, an honorary fellow of Lucy Cavendish College, succeeded her father on the throne of Denmark, and in the US, the first female FBI agents were sworn in. And I gave birth to my only daughter, got a PhD, and started the first journal devoted to women writers. And I have to say that the combining of all those was extremely difficult, and I think that it probably still would be, despite all these changes. Since these historic events, Lucy Cavendish has grown significantly, over 50% in the last 5 years, until we have now 350 graduates and undergraduate students. Many have not taken a traditional route into university, or having reached a particular point in their lives and careers, have decided to return to higher education. Outstanding mature women from a very wide variety of backgrounds, from all over the world, come to the college to get a Cambridge education at the time in their lives that suits them, because, as we all know, the trajectory of many women's lives is rather different from that of the male professional. Lucy Cavendish alumni can be found in all walks of life and on every continent, carrying out great research and contributing to the economies and societies and families throughout the world. So, that's my little pitch for Lucy Cavendish. If you don't know us, and I think many people in the university don't, please do come and visit us sometime. We are just up the road from Churchill and rather behind St John's in many ways, alas. They have a great deal more land than we have, but we are a nice college and do come and visit. So I'm now delighted to introduce Dr. Anne Lim, who is a valued member of Lucy Cavendish College community and is going to chair the conversation on science, society and the future.
Thank you,
Anne.
Thank you, Jan, and a warm welcome to you all to this conversation, as we hope it will be. We have a stellar panel of people around me who want to engage in conversation with you, and my role is merely to ensure that you get the opportunity to ask them questions and to give them maximum opportunity to talk to you. So I'll be keeping time and I'll be inviting them in and looking at you to make sure that you can interact with us. We are 5 on the stage at the moment. There is another Anne, unless I shift over and become somebody else who I think may or may not join us later on. As indeed, I hope you can live with this flexibility. The session will be a little fluid. They'll be dropping in and out. I mean, we hope if you come in, you will stay. But please do not be put off by the fact that people have been invited to come in and throughout the next hour and a quarter take part in this according to their own personal timetables and commitments. There's a huge amount going on in this Festival of Alumni this weekend, and a lot of competing pressures on people's time for that. However, we think you've made a great choice to come to this session on science, society and the future. Very grateful to David and to Jan from Churchill and from Lucy Cavendish, and indeed to our colleagues from King's and Clare for organising this. So that's the format and the timing. Each panellist is actually going to start with giving their impressions, their thoughts, their experiences, in brackets, if they were born, in 1972. I will come in at the end and say something. I was around in 1972. And we just hope that will kick things off. We've got a varied panel, as I say, with between them a fantastic collection of experience. And that will guide us into the discussions and the conversations that you might want to have. So I'm going to start at this end with Otterline. You've got a leaflet, and therefore I won't read out the very short biography of each of the speakers. But Professor Otterline, Laser, Otterline, you go first and tell us anything you want to about 1972 and your thoughts.
Thank you. So I'm going to speak mostly about things after 1972. Well, I will start in 1972, in 1972 I was 7, so mostly I was interested in hopscotch and other such important activities. And, but in my field, which is developmental genetics, the field was just at the kind of dawn of the molecular biology era, just a whole slew of new techniques and ways of analysing DNA were coming on stream, and the ability to make this link between the sequence of DNA in each cell in an organism and what the whole organism is doing, that vista was just kind of opening up as a really a place where you really could make some progress, I think. And by the time I got to Cambridge, which was in 1983, that whole revolution was in full swing, and I was absolutely gripped by the discoveries that were coming out year on year as I was at Cambridge, and was particularly influenced by an absolutely fantastic third-year course that was, at that time, interdepartmental. I was doing Part 2 genetics on developmental biology, and the extraordinary progress being made in understanding how development works, how you go from a single cell, the fertilized egg, through to a complex multicellular organism with many different types of cell in different places in your body or in the body of the organism doing different things at the right time. It's just a beautiful thing that happens, and understanding how that happens has really, as I say, it gripped me in that course, and it's been what I've been doing ever since. Only I've not been doing it in animal systems, I've been doing it in plant systems, because it struck me that there wasn't nearly so much work going on in that area, and the fact that plants change the way they do that depending on the environment in which they're growing, so you can wind up with a very different looking plant depending on where the plant is, I found that really exciting. So that's what I did, and that's what I've been doing ever since, and that's where I am now back in Cambridge in this new institute, where the focus is trying to understand that and to roll in the whole range of new techniques which continue coming online, genomics, post-genomics, fancy imaging techniques, computational modelling, to really build a predictive understanding of how that works. I'm having a ball, as you can tell. In terms of these wider issues over that period of time between 1972 to now, I would say, I'm a woman, I'm doing science. I've not had that many direct experiences of difficulties with that. Obviously, I'm doing the juggling thing with my family. I have a wonderfully supportive husband, which is very helpful. I think there is still a lot of kind of subliminal difficulties for we live in Britain in the 21st century where things are not completely equal yet, and we need to be alert to that and continue to work on it. But I would say in my discipline, the biggest threat at the moment is, I would classify it as fear. And that comes in right from the beginning, from school level now, where we're told science is really difficult And I think that results in a lot of people being put off it, disengaging, and then through society there's a kind of science phobia and mistrust, which is a big problem that I think needs tackling. And in molecular biology, well, in biology in general, in academia, it's very competitive, and that's fine, and it should be, but the emphasis has shifted away from trying to do the best science you can towards trying to gain the best metrics you can, and that is not an attractive thing for a lot of people, and that the way the competition is playing out, I think, is discouraging really good imaginative scientists from going into science and disproportionately discouraging women. I have a kind of catchphrase, which is that women are too scared to stay in and men are too scared to get out. Because I think women and men face that level of arbitrary competition differently. They respond to that differently. So that's what I would conclude. Fantastic opportunities, but the threat brought by fear.
Offline, that's absolutely perfect. I mean, it's just amazing what you can pack into barely over 3.5 minutes, isn't it? And I'm sure, and I'm sure we'll given you lots of things to want to probe more deeply. So moving down the line, and we will let Anne catch her breath, we move to Dr. Lisa Jardine-Wright, who is Director of Studies here in Physics in Churchill. Lisa.
So I thought I'd focus a little bit on my connection with Cambridge and my connection with Churchill College and how things have changed for me. I'm actually one of the fortunate few, I think, that became to Cambridge in 1994 as an undergraduate student in natural sciences, and I've forgotten to leave. I'm still here. I studied at Trinity College, actually, as an undergraduate in natural sciences, and then stayed on to do my doctorate in theoretical cosmology. And it's Churchill College, actually, that's responsible for my husband. So I met him here in Churchill, so it has a lot to answer for. I've continued as a postdoc and have come to Churchill College now as a fellow and as a director of studies in physics. What does my life involve now? Well, my life involves going from being the student to teaching the next generation of students and encouraging the next generation of students. This year, this week, in fact, I saw 2,400 14 to 16-year-olds pass through the doors of the Cavendish Laboratory for an event that shows them how physics takes place all around them every day at an event called Physics at Work. I'm also now, unbelievably perhaps, one of a team of female directors of studies. So all of the first-year natural science directors of studies here at Churchill are now women. So we are leading. I actually had a male student at one of the open days put his hand up and say, "Are there any male scientists in Churchill?" Which I saw as a bit of a win, really. I am a cosmologist, so I thought I would also mention a little, very briefly, how things have evolved over cosmology. The universe is the oldest thing that we know of, if you can call it a thing at that. And yet cosmology is probably one of the youngest scientists if you define cosmology as we do today. So over hundreds of thousands of years, people have been fascinated with the skies, but only in the 1920s and early 1930s did we even conceive that there was something outside of our own galaxy, the Milky Way. And only then did we start to question and wonder about what goes beyond our own galaxy into this idea of a universe. Do we know whether it's finite? Do we know whether it's infinite? The answer is no, we don't. So in terms of encouraging the next generation of scientists, there are lots of questions out there that are still yet to be answered. And I think that's a key thing for encouraging the next generation of female scientists as well. It's particularly relevant to Cambridge and in the 1970s because in 1974, Martin Ryle won the Nobel Prize for his study of radio sources. And that really was one of the key pieces of evidence that put to rest the debate, partly that was going on here in Cambridge, about whether the Big Bang ever existed. Was there a Big Bang explosion, or did the universe exist in a steady state, as Fred Hoyle wanted to believe? Now, there are still cosmologists out there that believe that the steady state could be a theory. However, most of us are on board with the Big Bang theory. The 1970s also saw major changes in cosmology. In 1979, Alan Guth came up with his idea of inflation, giving yet more weight and more coherence to the Big Bang theory. So I find it quite amazing that such a young science of cosmology has evolved so much over such a short period of time, from the late 1920s, early 1930s through to the present day, where we're putting satellites into space that can analyse radiation from only 300,000 years after the Big Bang. So the most exciting field for young scientists. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, marvellous timekeeping and a wonderful array of things to taste your or tempt your palate with, perhaps I should say. I'm going, if I may, to move to the other end of the table and to another woman physicist, Helen. If you don't mind, we'll come back then up to the middle, because that'll just give a chance for Anne to have settled down. So Dr. Helen Zersky, over to you.
I just have a few random thoughts, really. I was an undergraduate here and then a PhD student here, and it's fair to say that I was the only female physicist in my year at Churchill, and it never occurred to me, the whole issue of the sort of women in science basically annoyed me a little bit, as much as I thought about it, because I felt it just didn't apply to me, and that I was very, very fortunate in lots of ways. The time it really did occur to me, actually, was the day before. I remember the night before I got my results in my final year. And I remember sitting on the stairs in the student house I was living in, and it never occurred to me before. My mum started a physics degree, and she didn't finish. And she didn't finish, firstly, because it turned out she was better at maths, and she probably shouldn't have been told to do physics, but if women didn't do physics, they certainly didn't do maths. And the other thing was the sort of oppressive male environment that she found herself in Bradford University in the late 1960s. And I remember sitting on that step and thinking, my mum didn't have the chance to do this. You know, it was a sort of... I'd never really thought about what it meant not to have had that opportunity, you know, that I'd completely taken for granted. So I think that's very important. And that, you know, so it was relatively late, if you like, in my academic career that I really thought about that my mum didn't have that opportunity because she was a woman. And so... Yeah, the current battles still go on. I'm a physicist. I'm sort of moonlighting as an oceanographer, really. And next week I'll go to sea, spend 6 weeks on a research ship. And research ships are environments which are still predominantly male. The way it's sort of built into the architecture of the ship in a lot of ways. They're very male environments. And there are very few women oceanographers. There are women that go to sea, but they face a different set of problems. And in a way, I think that'll be one of the last bastions of gender equality, because the way ships work, the way that you have discussions is very male-oriented. Partly because of hundreds and hundreds of years of naval history that was all done by men. They did things their way. So the battle is ongoing. The time I think now about gender and Churchill. Actually, so Lisa was saying that she's now one of the two female directors of studies here. I remember saying, so Dave Green was my director of studies for all 4 years I was at Churchill. I'm sure many of you will know him. And I said to him on graduation day, he asked a question about something, and I said, I've never been supervised by or with another female in my entire my entire time at Cambridge. And the only exception I could think of was being lectured by Athene Donald, who I see in the audience over there at the Cavendish. But it had never occurred to me. It was effectively a gender-neutral environment. And that was actually very useful for me, because there wasn't a big set of men and a big set of women, we were just all people. It was actually interesting how being a complete minority almost took the problem away, for me, in any case. So now it's brilliant that there are female directors of studies and that all students will come into contact, be supervised by or with a female at some point during their degree. And the last thing I want to say is that I see, even though I wasn't aware of really the issues of women in science for many years, because I was very fortunate and they really just didn't apply to me a lot of the time. Sadly, with age comes wisdom, and as you go along, you start to spot the differences and the different ways that women are treated. And now it really bugs me. And in a way, I hate that it bugs me. I hate that I see things and I go, that was discrimination. That wasn't fair. Because I don't want to live that life. I don't want to be this person who's sort of mentally pointing fingers and going, that's not on. But it does still happen. And it's surprising to me that, we are in a very well-educated environment, and, there may still be issues with women in this environment now. as was said earlier, they're more to do with perception and fear, and they're more difficult things to put a finger on. They're still there. But as I've done more and more TV stuff, and I've come into contact with more and more young females, and especially from very different regions of the country, especially away from big cities, I've been astonished at how those old gender stereotypes still exist, utterly horrified. We live in a very privileged world, you know, among the sort of educated classes, whatever you call it. In most of this country, those stereotypes are still exceptionally strong. And now I really care about this a lot more than I did, because I've seen people come up to me after talks or lectures and say, I didn't know women could do that. And my initial response is, it's 2013. What makes you think women can't talk about, you know, general relativity, or to talk about how the planet works, or whatever it is? It's horrifying to me that this still exists. And for any of you who are really interested in these issues, there's an excellent book called Delusions of Gender. I highly recommend reading it. And it really brought home, one last thing I'm going to say, is the thing that I took away from that book is that if you test men and women on some gender stereotyped task, for example, you know, cooking or maths or something that one is supposed to be better at than the other, you can measure how well they do, and that's all right. Conduct the same study with an equivalent group of people and add a box at the start that says, are you male or female? And all the men magically not only think they get better at maths, but actually get better at maths. And all the women not only think they get worse, but they actually get worse. And this is the environment that, you know, in order to get rid of that, what you need to, you know, society has to move towards a point where there's no societal expectations attached to either gender when it comes to ability. And this is why Churchill admitting women, you know, is one of the very vital early steps, because it's normalising women doing the same things that men do. And I had never really appreciated that until very recently.
Helen, thanks so much, and thanks for being so honest about your own experiences and your own journey. Three formidable women scientists, as you've just heard. Equally stellar women in society, academics and business, and indeed in politics. So if we just turn now to Dr. Belinda Brooks-Gordon, and hear a little bit of her story. Belinda, thank you.
Thank you. 1972, I was 10, growing up in northern Milltown, Radcliffe, where Danny Boyle also comes from. And one of my memories of 1972 there were two main factories, Pilkington's Glass and a paper mill. And it was a very, very gendered environment. That the pay differentials, the job differences, only the bosses in the factories were men, and when in the local council, my father was a councillor, all masculine to a body, and the women would wear hats, the wives, on the first day of council. So that was 1972. It was also a similar period to the one we're facing now with regard to Europe, because 1975 was the referendum, but of course 1971 and 72 were fraught battles in Parliament about joining the European Economic Union, which of course we did in 73. And the EU led to a lot of improvements in equality and advancement of women. And now, as a Euro candidate, one of the things that the first thing that struck me in Brussels in June when I went over with a delegation of candidates was how different the European Parliament looks. It's very, very much more gender balanced, but also in terms of colour and in terms of visible disabilities. It was very, very different, and we've still got a long, long way to go before Westminster looks and behaves like the European Parliament. So there are two contrasts. Also, the IRA is mentioned. I hope we will talk about terrorism a little bit. My mother was Irish, and one of my other memories of 1972 was the fact that our car would be stripped down to the axle when we used to get the ferry to Ireland because my mother was Irish. And some of the impact of that on women in current day informs some of my current work. So I have two strands to my life, an academic and politician. And I came to Churchill as a single parent. I'd left school at 16. I was a beautician for many years, partly thanks to very poor careers advice when I'd said I was interested in the law, being told the law's quite hard for girls, what about being a legal secretary? So I ended up being a beautician, which I enjoyed for many years, and then came to Churchill as a mature student, a single parent with 2 children. And my memories of that are very different to the memories the porters have, who tell me, you were so well organised, you'd clap your hands and say, come on, children, and they'd trot after you, following you as you wafted your gown. That's not how I remembered it at all. I remember lists and lists. And I also remember a lot of very good women leaving because they knew they weren't going to get promoted in Cambridge. Women who had been good female mentors. Linda McDowell was one, geographer, human geographer, is now prof at Oxford. And she went via UCL. She saw the amount of women here in Cambridge. The vet school recently applauded itself for appointing the first female professor. So, we're not there yet. Although, just to be slightly controversial in response to what Ottiline said, the REF and the metric system actually work quite well for me as somebody in an interdisciplinary subject. I publish in law journals, I publish in medical journals, and very often it's the men who will swagger in and say I should be promoted. For me, it was more straightforward. If I publish in the BMJ and I publish in the highly rated law journals, it's much easier then to go and say, actually, yes, perhaps I'm worth that. When you can see yourself on a sort of a ladder with others. So there is another side to that. I'll briefly end with some of the things that we have tried to change. It was one of the reasons I started doing politics. I sat on the working party that put forward the women's policy document that we fought the last election on as Lib Dems. 65% of that is now government policy, so things like shared parental leave, I hope will become the norm in the future. I sit with Sal Brinton. We've just finished doing our education policy document with things like professional independent careers advice with Sal Brinton, who is an old Churchillian and now in the House of Lords. And a final thing to just throw into the pot, the 3 strands of my research probably didn't exist in 1972. My work focuses on vulnerable women. I do systematic reviews and meta-analyses of psychological interventions for sex offenders, what works and for whom. And so that's a subject that actually became much more relevant and thought about and recognised, indeed, since 1972. Another strand of my work focuses on the civil liberties and human rights of sex working women and those in the nighttime economy. And the final strand focuses on FGM, female genital mutilation. I don't even think the word was in existence in 1972. And Nigeria, the country I grew up in, latterly, it's something that's increased very sadly in the northern part of Nigeria. But that work, where we work with the Somali community in London and in Birmingham, sometimes women who have escaped from terrible circumstances, then there are terrible things going on in the families with mutilation. And so those are subjects that didn't actually exist as academic disciplines in that period. So the disciplines themselves have changed as well.
Belinda, thank you so much for enriching the what's on offer for talking about later on much more widely. The problem is we have got to end this session at 3:15, so we've one final input from the panellists, and then I'll open it up for questions. So,
thank you.
Dr. Angover.
Thank you. Apologies to all of you for arriving late. So I come from a lucky gene pool. That usually means that you've been born into a wealthy family. I wasn't born into a wealthy family. I was born into an academic family. And my Scots-Irish parents valued education enormously and basically said it was the main thing that they would give me. And it's true. I haven't taken anything from them since age 18. And I also was a lucky gene pool in the sense that I had a brother and who was very talented. And he ended up getting into Cambridge and coming to this rather unusual place called Clare. And I got to visit it at age 16 and thought it was rather beautiful. But we came from Liverpool, and I was very afraid of Cambridge. I thought it was the South and the devil, and because ironically, I also visited Pilkington's as a part of my careers education from my high school. And the reason that's important is that the careers were very good, and I think high school is incredibly important, and as much as the colleges can do to keep links with the high schools that develop science careers or industrial careers is really, really important. Because I had the privilege of going through a morgue and going to Pilkington's, and my mother wanted me to be a doctor, and I went into a morgue and almost fainted under the formaldehyde and said, that's not a good idea, and went to Pilkington's and thought, this is fantastic. There's all this big machinery, it's hot, it's exciting. And I ended up applying to Cambridge to do material science. And they said, how do you know about material science? 16, I was 17, how do you know about material science? So I said, well, I went to Pilkington's. And that careers visit made all the difference. Anyway, I also got very excited by a book called Richard Gordon wrote in 1970s, which was Crack Theory and Why Things Don't Fall Through the Floor, which just fascinated me because it never occurred to me that they should. And there was all this big equipment, and I figured out if I went to material science, I could break things. Now, I don't normally make things. I wasn't very good at making things, but breaking them I was very good at. And so we got to study fracture theory and all the rest of it. But as you can tell, my interest was very applied, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time here at Clare. I did end up succumbing to the tension between going to Sheffield and Cambridge, and decided to come to Cambridge because it was just so beautiful. Clare is a wonderful college, and we were lucky to have a third of women in our year, and that made things very equal in terms of how people behaved, and much more balanced and much more like my normal life from high school. But I wanted to do this really weird thing, which was to go into industry. And in those times, it was, you apply to the scientific civil service, or you continue in an academic career. And I wanted to go into industry. And there was if anything, it wasn't, I don't think that I suffered at all from any gender bias in my education, but I did suffer from, why on earth do you want to go into industry? You're going into trade, for goodness sake. You're going to not use your brain. And I thought, that's not the way I see it. I went through these workplaces and I thought they were really not well run, and I thought I could make a difference. So the long and the short of it is Clare luckily had a fellowship to exchange students with Yale, and I won one of those and went to Yale for two years to do a business degree. And this was in 76, so it was a time of great industrial strife in the UK, and I thought I was unusual in leaving, but sadly I wasn't. A lot of people left at that time. And I tried every 2 years to come back, and every 2 years I couldn't get a job that was anything like as competitive or as responsible as I could get in the US. And so it was after I left education and when I hit industry that I really began to hit discrimination. And I stayed there. I stayed in the US for 13 years until in the late 80s, I finally got myself in a position where I could get an equivalent level of responsibility back here. And I'd been very angry at not at the education system. The education system had been phenomenal, but the way industry had rejected me. And it wasn't because I was female. It was because I was educated. So I can list them: British Steel, Rolls-Royce, Delta Box. I can remember the interviews. And they just didn't want an educated person, let alone an educated woman. But it had changed. But one of the other things that had made me change during that period was a recognition, again, from having lived and worked in America for so long, is the importance of new businesses. And therefore, I had migrated my way into wanting to be a venture capitalist, which is to finance new businesses. And I actually ended up getting a job back here in London in '89, thinking I'd stay for a year, go back to the US, get rid of all my anger. And I didn't, because I came back and the world had changed. There was a new vibrancy about entrepreneurship. Women were more accepted. And I began to see that I could really make a difference here. And so I spent 5 years in a firm called Apax. They taught me the business. I ran one of the companies that we financed. We listed it on the London Stock Exchange. I wasn't allowed to be CEO because I was a woman, but I was allowed to be COO, which meant I ran the place but didn't get the privilege, so there was a little bit of a tinge on that. But eventually I left. I'm really an investor and became a business angel and set up my own firm in 1997, and we've been doing this for 16 years, which is investing in technology companies across Europe, many of whom are in Cambridge, but an awful lot are actually broadly across Europe as well. And most recently, actually, are going to start investing, and this is what I'm really excited about, globally in technologies that transform the emerging middle class in emerging markets, because we believe that technology can really transform those societies as well. Venture capital, of all financial services, one last thing, surprisingly, is the one where you'll see most women. You won't see them in private equity, you won't see them in banking. You might see them in asset management, and it's because it's creative and relationship-driven as opposed to adversarial and power-driven. And you know, I think it's been a joy to have that privilege of building a business myself and coming back here to give back.
And thank you. It does feel almost cruel to cut any of them off, but thank you, all of you, for, I hope, getting things off to a really good start. Now, we've got 45 minutes, and it would be really helpful if you want to raise a topic or ask a question, if you just say who you are as well, so that the panel have some sense of where the questions are coming from. And I think I understand, at any rate, there is a microphone. Please don't be inhibited by this. We'd like you to use it for the very reason that was explained by David at the beginning, which is that we're having a film made of this so that those who couldn't get here today might want to dip into it, and we want them to be able to hear it properly. So raise your hand if you don't mind, if you've got a question, and try and catch my eye, and a mic will be brought to you. So let's start here at the front, and the mic's on its way down. Jolly good.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth McWilliams. I matriculated in English here at Churchill in '92. I'd like to pick up on something that particularly that Ottoline and Helen alluded to, but that's come from a lot of the panel's comments, about encouraging women into science and in tandem with a kind of gendering of society. As a mother to a young boy and a young girl, I'm constantly finding that the society now, which I feel should be less gendered, is, if anything, becoming more so. I take my children to toy shops. There's a boys' toys aisle and a girls' toys aisle. In the blue boys' toys aisle, there'll be science sets, dinosaurs, aeroplanes, rockets. In the girls' toys aisle, there will be knitting, cooking, T-shirt design. All of these subjects, I feel, are equally valid, equally fun things for children to do. And if anything, my daughter and my son would probably try to swap aisles. Do the panel think that this could change? And how can we... Is it a hindrance to encouraging girls to become women scientists?
Okay, great question. Any one of our scientists, to begin with, want to try and pick that up? Okay, let's start here. Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. There is ridiculous gender stereotyping right from day one. It's difficult to overcome, and I must say that as you mentioned, there's a lot of focus on how the girls should have access to the boys' toys. I think it's equally important that the boys should have access to the girls' toys. I think this is something we tend to forget, and I think it's indicative of the situation we're in. It's fine for girls to aspire to male things because male things are good. It's not fine for boys to aspire to girls' things because girls' things are bad. And I think we need to work hard to flatten that across the board. How you do it is quite difficult. I mean, the consumer power at some level, but you have to be a pretty determined person to overcome the peer pressure your children are under in wanting the same things that their friends have, and so on and so forth. Athenia is sitting in the audience. We were at an event a while ago, and she had these brilliant wordles made from the words that came from boys' toys and girls' toys. And it was, power and action on the boys' toys and sparkle and magic on the girls' toys. It was really quite shocking. And I mean, I can't offer an instant solution, but I do think right from the beginning, it seeps into your subconscious, and it's very hard to shift.
I think you're sparklingly powerful, all of you that are here, but that's no answer. Lisa, and then I'll come to Helen.
Well, I don't have children myself, but I do remember exactly what you described when I was a child, but it was dead simple. As soon as I walked through those doors, the doors of the toy shop, I was down the boys' aisle. Wasn't even remotely interested in Barbie or Cindy. And I have absolutely no sense of where that came from. So it's quite interesting. I think you can overcome those stereotypes, and I think you can overcome the peer group pressure. I was very fortunate never to feel that peer group pressure, and just really got stuck into those things that I was interested in. So, but it's a difficult question. I have no great solution.
It's very obvious this is a problem. I think that, first of all, they're getting called on it more. I would be optimistic because it's very obvious now that, people spot it, post it on Twitter, make a lot of fuss about it, and things are changing. The other thing, though, I would say, I've just written a piece about this, published in The Observer in the next couple of weeks, just before Ada Lovelace Day. And if you don't know about Ada Lovelace Day, it's coming up on the 10th or 15th of October. It's a day about women in science, basically. But anyway, it occurred to me that one of the problems with all of this is that women do a lot of things, a lot of these gendered things that we think are women only, knitting and sewing was the example I used, are actually technology. There is part of the problem that we say we don't see pictures of women astronauts and women, architects, whatever it is. But if you look at the skill needed to knit or to sew, I don't know how many people in this room know how to sew. It's a very technical thing. And when it comes to, spatial awareness and the sort of what it is you need to do it, they're exactly the same. And so I would first of all emphasize that, show, demonstrate. If your daughter is interested in knitting, perfectly reasonable thing to do, go, look, this is making stuff. Emphasize that. The other thing, and there's actually a really obvious example of that, which is lovely. So back in February for a TV programme, I had to arc weld. Talking to a camera while arc welding is really hard. It's also pointless because you're wearing a visor so no one can see your face. But anyway, had to learn to arc weld in America. And taught by this old school Arizona and big moustache. And I could do it, right? I just picked up this thing and I could do it. And he was astonished. How can you arc weld? And I was like, because it's exactly the same as icing cakes. Yeah. There is no difference. The way you stand, the way you hold the thing, what you're trying to do is exactly the same. And the last thing to say is that the maker culture is actually a very good crossover of these two things. For those of you who don't know much about the maker culture, it's a sort of new, it's had different forms for a while, but it's basically craft technology, and it's becoming this fusion of electronics and old school craft stuff. So, for example, people are embedding electronics in clothes, and there's maker fairs all over the place. There's things that kids can do in maker fairs, and it's everything is equal. As long as you're making things in that environment, they like you, and everybody is welcome. And I think they have the balance very right. So those are places you can go, and, your son might start with the electronics, but discover that if he wants to put them in his T-shirt, he has to sew, and your daughter might do the same thing the other way. And so those are environments. These environments do exist where the artificial boundaries we've put on have been taken away, and you can see that we're just people making stuff.
Fascinating. Belinda. Oh.
Where does it come from? Empirically, it comes from all of us, because research shows that when you have a baby wrapped in a neutral blanket and people are told it's a girl, they'll behave differently to how they'll behave if they're told it's a boy. And they'll make more cooing noises and be more affectionate if it's a girl. And if it's a boy, they'll make more comments about how clever they look and things like this. And that's a very robust finding across a number of cultures. So it's something we all do every day. When I was a girl, I wanted a Meccano set, never got one, because girls weren't given Meccano sets. So I don't feel quite so strongly about the sort of manufacturer's pink it and shrink it attitude, because that can sometimes be a gateway into technology. And I was going to mention, so I'm glad you mentioned the maker fairs, so I was going to mention those and the link between. It's no surprise one of the things you couldn't send through the post during the war because of coding were knitting patterns. So, because they're...
I just remember something really funny. I was at a friend's house last night. He's just moving house. He was showing me his train set that he had when he was a 7-year-old. He was very excited about his train set. He brought out this book of all the different ways you could put train tracks in. And I was like, that's knitting patterns for tracks. And it is. It's exactly the same. So I just remember that.
Some of the psychometric tests for pattern matching and beads and stuff. Exactly they're just like knitting patterns and things. So don't knock that as a way of developing spatial awareness necessarily. It's when it can be used to prevent children going on and doing other things. They can be gateways, so it can be used positively. And I was just going to make a final comment of when I, having divorced and a single parent, and as a postgrad student, one of the ways I managed to get myself back on my feet again was by developing houses. And the builders and the developers that I worked with said, how do you learn to do that? And a lot of it were domestic skills. I'd never picked up a drill as a child or anything, but a lot of the decorating skills that I just learned from a book, because that's where I learnt most of the things that I do, whether it was cookery or whatever as a child. It was a very gendered environment in Nigeria. It was almost like white mischief with the men working and the women wives, but some of those skills were then transferable when I needed them. But it was having the confidence and, in fact, the desperation, but it meant to use them. But it meant I was able to develop 3 houses and pick those skills up, building skills, very easily. I had no fear of the machinery, having used those skills domestically.
Okay, another question just 2 rows back. Lady with a hand up.
Thank you. I'm Nicola Jackson from Clare, 1973. And hello, Anne. It's an absolute joy to see you. Would I be allowed the luxury of 2 questions, Anne?
Yes, go on, if they're short.
First question. I'd love to know how many other 72ers and 73ers and 74ers are there here? Do we need to all give you a clap, so to speak? So lovely to see everybody. Hello, everybody. Secondly, all sorts of things coming to mind. I was horrified this morning to have to choose between 2 types of first birthday card for my wonderful new granddaughter, having 3 sons. I had no idea of this world, and that was John Lewis this morning, and I chose a very nice yellow giraffe, which was not gender stereotype. And then raising it to awareness level, I've found as I've emerged from my family and my the later years of my professional career in community education, having left research after postdoc level here, mainly because I was not going to be able to raise a child at that time and work in the lab here at Cambridge in a way that would allow me to see my child. And I share Belinda's area of psychology, and I just simply was not prepared to not see my first son. Therefore, I find increasingly that, as Helen has said, my awareness gets greater and greater that the barriers are political, social, societal, familial. In my own case, I have a very high achieving and wonderful sister who's a surgeon, just retired, and actually she found her sewing skills, all those hours over the dresses. We made all our clothes in 1973, I can tell you. Do you remember that, Anne? Exactly. Yes. And she found that her, as an advanced ear, nose and throat surgeon doing deep brain stuff, her skills were actually very advanced. However, having arrived at Cambridge, completely off my own bat. Many of us hadn't visited Cambridge before we came for interview. I don't know if anybody else shares that, but I first saw Clare when I arrived for interview. One beauty, and as Anne says, completely stunned by the beauty of it. But I had that drive. I obtained a very good natural sciences degree here, but I was then somewhat at a loss, and I think I'd come from a family of strong women. My mother was a working doctor, and the point for me was this careers advice, which was a complete disaster at that time here at Cambridge. I was vaguely interested in the civil service and got very short shrift at the Cambridge University Careers Service when I went up to see them. Very interesting. And so I did the second best and went to Oxford to do a doctorate. Met my lovely husband to my left here, so that was all great. But I still think that, going back to Janet's comment about the very low proportion of female high-achieving academics, Lib Dems, no women on the cabinet at the moment.
2 ministers, certainly, Jo Swinson and Lynn Featherstone.
In a cabinet group, I think not. And of course, poor Sarah Tethers. I share those tendencies. However, I'm aghast, and Sarah Tether is just bailing out for whatever reason. Anyway, there are a group of us from around this period, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to see Anne again today, who just feel it would be very nice to do something to really mark what went on in 72, 73, 74 in terms of support for women academics. From my own experience, I still feel very strongly that one of those reasons that's going on is the fact that women, as they approach their 30s, were just doing a lot. That's when our children tend to be born. That's when we're making entrepreneurial moves or academic moves or whatever. And I think it would be very nice if something that came out of this would be, we didn't do it for the 40th, we're all too busy, I think, but if we aim for the 50th, some of us at a Clare gathering the other day were saying we might get there and get something together to at least be symbolic and iconic of that need to support women, particularly at that late research student stage. So I've finally got to my question, and thank you, Anne, for indulging me. My question is, what do you think the state of careers education is for women here at Cambridge now, and what can be done to improve it?
Okay, no, thank you for telling us your story and I think throwing out quite a few other opportunities and challenges for people. That's perfectly okay, but a very, very clear question. Shall we turn to the people working directly in the university first? You two, well,
Would you like to go first, Ottilie?
Do you mind going first, Lisa?
No, that's fine. There are a couple of things, actually, that I wanted to mention that came out of what you said. We talk about women having children and a particular busy time of our lives. I think the other thing that is relevant to that is what we call the two-body problem. I've been very lucky that my two-body problem is solved here in Cambridge at the moment. And by that we mean partners, be it either way, husbands and wives or wives and husbands, being able to work in the same university. I've known many academics that have had husbands or wives living many, many miles away, and they've existed in this separate relationship. So that's one thing that potentially is investigated a little bit more in America, I think, than it is here in the UK. So that's one comment that I had with regards to that. In careers education here in the UK, the Careers Service has moved forward greatly, I think, and there are a number of opportunities made available to our graduates now, both male and female. One of the things that I'm aware of as being a physicist, and I hope I'm not being too provocative in saying this, is that physicists are widely employable people, and we're increasingly educating them to the fact that they can pretty much go on and do whatever they want to do, and therefore making that knowledge available to them, including the example that I gave earlier, 14 to 16-year-olds coming to visit us in preparation, thinking so much further ahead that physics, as one example, makes many things available to them in terms of careers in their future. So I would like to think that we are, as a university, educating both the younger age group as to what their future could hold, but also that once our undergraduates are coming towards the end of their careers, the Careers Service in particular now are working on a great number of internships and focusing very strongly on that second year interval between second year and part two, and what we would call part 1A first and part 1B second year, so that students can actually go and taste the professional world out there in internships. And so there's an increasing number of those becoming available as well.
Anne and then Belinda. Yeah.
Thanks, Nicola. I don't know about the Careers Service per se, but one of the things that I do have a comparison between is American universities and Cambridge. And Cambridge has come a long way in its relationship with its alumni, but in one dimension, which is fundraising. And there are so many more dimensions to the alumni relationship that American universities take advantage of. For example, they consider not just careers development at the time of graduation, but through their entire career, so that they actually think about how alumni can come and connect and network to other alumni to find unique skills and much later in their life. It's a permanent aspect of the alumni activity, and in many ways, we are members of our colleges, and we need to figure out how to stay members and how the university needs to think how to relate to us, not as, I'm very happy and pleased about the development activity, but not just in that dimension. And the second, and that what goes along with that, is that there's no such thing as a single career anymore. Almost anybody graduating today will probably have 2 or 3 phases to their career. And this is advantageous to women if we can figure out how to help them re-enter the workforce. And this is something I think that we can do in our sort of generation, which is figure out how to take the talent back into serious roles in the workforce, whether it's academic roles or industrial roles. And I think an effort on that at 40 and 50, not at just 20, will make a huge difference to how the workforce is perceived. Because women will take time out for their children, and that's perfectly legitimate. But that doesn't mean that when that's over, there isn't a very important role that they could play by rejoining the workforce and taking on leadership positions. So I think that's an initiative. If we could figure out how to embark on that sort of later career development, I would really love to participate in.
Thanks, Anne. Some really good messages in there for the development people and alumni people in the room as well. So, Belinda, you mentioned careers earlier on, didn't
Absolutely.
you? Yeah, so,
I concur with everything the other two panellists have said, but also pick up on your point about familial support. On the one hand, I benefited from not having a partner in a way. I didn't have to negotiate about childcare. My children went to bed at 7. I got another 5 hours work done till midnight in the evenings, living. And I chose Churchill because it had the Wolfson Flats. I would never have thought of coming to Cambridge. I had tutors at Middlesex Poly who said, go to Cambridge, you'll outgrow this place. They'd been to Cambridge. One of those was Carla Willig. So the importance of having female mentors who just open the chink of light and then say, you should try that. And I try and remember that with my own students and also with political mentees, because it's so important. You may think it's obvious to the junior coming up. I also benefited at Cambridge from the Springboard programme and Felicia Huppert and some of the senior women here. One little story, when I first arrived in Cambridge, Linda McDowell had sent me, I'd mentioned Linda before, I'd written some research on attitudes to insider trading in the city and sexual harassment of female traders. And Linda sent me a piece that she'd written. I wish she hadn't, because it was highly theorised, it was beautifully written, it was a large empirical study, the kind of work I would have loved to have done. And it actually crushed my confidence. She'd said, ring me and we'll have lunch. And I didn't have the confidence to ring her for a term until she chased it up by email. Then she took me to lunch at Newnham, and we sat down with our trays, and Germaine Greer sat opposite. Germaine was writing Slipshod Sybils at the time and started to say something, and Linda said, oh, Germaine, this is business, Germaine, and Germaine got sort of wafted off. And I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. There was this women's space of women talking about women and interacting, and you know, it opened a world to me. And it does make me realise one of the things Cambridge has to do now is protect those female spaces. Because we can't assume that the world that we've won, that all the battles are won, because they're not. And some women are only allowed to come away and get their education, in particular 2 Muslim women who I've encouraged and mentored to apply to Cambridge, would only be allowed to leave home and live away from home and get an Oxbridge career if they weren't coming to a female college. So that's one of the things that I think Cambridge has to do, and possibly the other side. I have 4 children now, and one of those is over the other side, so someone has to go there. And politically, you mentioned the Lib Dems. There were a lot of women. Julian Huppert beat me for the Cambridge seat, so you know you'd have had a female MP had he not cornered the geeks vote better than I did. So I didn't play up my science credentials enough, it has to be said. But there were a lot of women in winnable seats, and they didn't just tip over the edge with the Clegg bounce and a lot of other and getting the vote out. So it's that political strategy that's hugely important. A fairer voting system would have allowed that to happen. Whether we have all women shortlists or not is a constant discussion. Things seem to be moving that way within the Lib Dems. People who for many years, Shirley Williams was for them, Jo Swinson very against them. Things are changing now. People who were very against them feel it may be the only way to get that critical mass. One of the things Sal Brinton has done was set up the leadership programme with Nick Clegg to bring forward and mentor women and marginalised groups. So that's one thing the Lib Dems are doing. I don't know about the other parties, but there has to be political will as well.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Just comment.
Yeah, Lisa, come back in. Yeah,
Sorry.
it's very difficult to catch.
Yeah, I've got
and then
context.
Helen. Go on,
Sorry.
Lisa. And Helen,
I
and
just-
then we'll look for another question.
Obviously, we're talking about the 40th anniversary here of women being admitted to the 4 colleges, and therefore it's only right that we focus on the gender issues, which are incredibly important. But I think it's also, I would also like to raise the issue, both as a tutor and a director of studies here in Churchill, that there are also many other things that we need to consider, I think, in promoting education to young people and the opportunities that are available to them. There are lots of other groups of students, male or female, that are less confident, for example. And so I think it is also important that all of these things that we talk about relating to gender issues, that there are mentors, role models in all of the other marginalised groups that there might be, or even groups that we don't think are marginalised, but within that, equally, there are male students that are not very confident at coming forward and making the opportunities that, or making use of the opportunities that are available to them. So I think we also need to bear that in mind, as well as these gender differences that we know are apparent.
I just want to say about the careers advice. I think one very important aspect to that is that there is still, I mean, and Anne alluded to this idea that there's this monolithic, you will choose a career at the age of whatever, and it will carry on. And basically, I still feel uncomfortable when people talk about my career. I haven't had a career, I just did some stuff. And then I did some other stuff that interested me, and then I did some more stuff that interested me. And I think one of the things, and it's a confidence issue potentially for both men and women, but you know, to just have, you know, so maybe things aren't going so well now. I don't think I can fix the current situation I'm in. Maybe I'll go and do something else. And having that sort of career support, I think that attitude is far more useful than you should do this or you should do this or these doors are open to you. I mean, the doors being open is important, but just to convey the idea that, you know, some people do, as long as you're doing something useful, and fair enough, if you want to be a doctor, you should probably go to medical school. But apart from that, you know, as long as you're gaining experience and you're doing interesting things, then maybe gain some other experience and do something different. There's no great boundaries there, and that is the career advice, which I think is really missing from the young people I talk to today. They all think they have to choose a thing, and then they're walled in for life, and it's a dreadful, dreadful attitude to have.
Exactly. Thank you. The question here from David, and then we'll go up the back there. Oh, okay. We'll do a quick comment then. Yes.
Conversation?
Yeah, do a quick comment, and then
So
we'll have
thank
a
you.
question.
I'm Judith Rommel. I'm a newly appointed fellow in St Edmund's College, and I'm very pleased to be here today. So her question included the question, what is currently happening at the university for women or people at the age of 30, and where are we heading to? So actually postdocs don't have alumni status at all. And we have, at the moment, there's somebody starting next week in an office just for the postdocs to work on that postdocs get alumni status, then they will have a centralized database where when postdocs coming here, women get advice on how to find housing, how to find daycare. Because we are, as postdocs, you are just like, you're coming here, and we are 3,500 postdocs at the moment, so it's the biggest number of employees at the university. And so finally they've recognized postdocs. I'm in a very lucky situation, so I think, yeah, it's good that this is moving on. Yeah.
Okay,
Just
thank
to
you
let you
for sharing that with us.
Yeah,
We'll come down here to the question and then go back up to the man behind you.
Thank you, David Wallace. Just to say that the whole issue of postdocs in the university is a huge one, and I think it is being addressed, but whether it will actually be addressed in the end, who knows, but that there is an aspiration to do something about that. So my question was, if I may, particularly about part-time working. Now, this started for me, it was about 8 years ago, actually. I don't know if Athena was there or not. There was a meeting at the Royal Society. It was Athena meeting. And Julia King, who is the Vice-Chancellor now at Aston, actually a fellow at the college as well, Julia King said she was so pleased to see that Rolls-Royce were advertising all their engineering positions as potentially part-time. I thought, this is a fantastic idea. So I went back to Loughborough, where I still had a bit of time to do it, and I said, why don't we advertise all our academic positions as potentially part-time? Because my own wife, Elizabeth, dropped out of physics teaching because she was part of the leaky pipeline, because she couldn't get a part-time job at the appropriate time in life. So my question is there a role for provision of more part-time working, or am I being really old-fashioned, and I should get away with the idea that it's only only the women that should be working part-time?
Interesting question. Okay, Helen.
So I see the whole issue as gender as a lever to have a bigger revolution. Right? It's very clear to me that academia, as an example, is broken in a lot of these structural things. And at the moment, the fashionable lever is gender diversity and other types of diversity. But actually, we can fix the system. And if the political sort of the thing we have to push with at the moment is diversity, then let's use that. But I think almost every single change, in fact, that would benefit women would also benefit men. And there's a really major issue here, because I think that what was said before about the men not feeling able, I think a big problem here is that women are actually at a stage now where they can say, I don't like that, and then they maybe leave their technical career. But the men don't have a route to say, I don't like that. So they keep banging their head against the wall. They're not happy because they're doing too much of a job and they don't feel able to say, I have a problem. The women are not happy because they're not there. So I think all of these issues, everything, will benefit men as well. The way the workforce is changing, it's really, really fast. You know, in 10 years' time, things will be different. And I know every period is a period of change, but it seems that now a lot of these issues are coming to the fore, and we can improve this for everybody. And this is just one lever. But let's fix the system for everyone.
Yes, so I have been a fan of part-time possibilities, job share possibilities, all kinds of interesting, flexible ways of doing things. To me, it's back to this kind of bean counting problem that goes on at the moment. There is a huge feeling of pressure, particularly at more junior levels in academia, to accumulate these different kinds of points that everybody is measuring. And that drives then an anxiety that you can't do it by working a sensible number of hours. And of course, we're all very motivated and excited about our stuff. We're happy to work some extra hours, and it's good. We do it because we like it. But at the same time, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, you can't possibly be a part-time academic. It's an oxymoron. And I think that attitude has to change. And I agree. You know, at some level, some of these measures, as was being said earlier on the panel, are helpful because they provide, quotes, objective comparisons. But a lot of them are no longer being used in that objective kind of way. They're being used inappropriately. And I think that underlying anxiety is at the base of a lot of these issues, like why women don't choose to stay beyond a postdoctoral level. It all kind of feeds together. It's a pressure cooker problem. And I agree it's completely within our power to shift it. But we're stuck in a bit of a vicious cycle at the moment.
Lisa, on that.
I guess I quite like at this point to fly the flag of the university to a certain extent. I've been very fortunate in my short career so far that the university has afforded me many opportunities in that part-time scenario. So as a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Astronomy, I was able to work part-time for the Royal Observatory in Greenwich as a consultant. I know it's not quite the part-time that Sir David Wallace mentioned there, but I've also then been able to almost carve out the career that I wanted for myself within the university, being able to become a fellow and a teaching fellow of the college here in Churchill, while simultaneously working with school students, simultaneously being able to lecture and teach undergraduates. And I never dreamt that that was going to be a possibility. I didn't know what I wanted my career to be, other than that I knew I wanted to do a PhD. After that, I had no fixed plans, but the university made it possible for me to do those things that I began to see that I thought I could excel at, that I had a particular skill in. I was fortunate enough to ask the question, and I think that's the main thing. It's the thing that I say to my students, is don't assume any door is closed, push it first. And then you never know, you might find that it actually opens for you. So don't make any assumptions, just really try and test the water, and hopefully there will be mentors. We will try and provide mentors around you that will help you make those things that you want to happen.
Thank you, Lisa. Belinda,
I'm going to pull 2 points together, David's and yours, about familial support, because I was very lucky. I was full-time PhD and working 2 days a week in a beauty salon in London. I had a lot of familial support. My widowed mother lived with me here at Churchill for a year, and and that meant I could go to international conferences, I could travel, I could present my work and everything else. So I was very lucky in that respect, having a really supportive mother whose own circumstances were able to slot in. And one of the things I certainly noticed when I got here to Cambridge was one of the first things people said was, "Are you a Churchill BA?" And no, I couldn't have come here. You don't have a creche. There was no creche at that stage. And one of the things that we know in the city is that a lot of and in many of the professions, in law and in medicine, women often leave at the birth of the second baby, not the first. They manage and struggle through when a lot of the impact is on them. It's the second that they hit that wall, that many of them leave, highly trained women. Some workplaces, and some of the city companies have been fantastic about this, setting up workplace creches because they've realised the economic benefits of having women in the workforce. But we also know education is a critical issue. 40% of undergraduate students are part-time. I mean, I'm at Birkbeck where it really matters, and I see people changing careers, sometimes downsizing. It's not necessarily a social mobility thing. They can be doing a very highly paid job for many, many years and find it completely unsatisfying and downsize and do something else. And psychology is one of those very popular subjects. So it's certainly something that governments have to pay attention to fly the flag for Sal Brinton again. Sal and I changed the education bill by making more allowance for part-time students. We recognised that. We'd both been in that situation, and we made the fee structure much fairer for those reasons. We also know part-time students are much more likely to come from non-traditional backgrounds and more marginalised groups. So it's a vital component that not only employers recognise and allow men and women to slot in and out of the workplace, but also education establishments, and it's where Churchill can make a difference. We don't offer an undergraduate part-time degree in Cambridge. So we close that door here. That's something that could be changed like that.
Thank you, Belinda. So there was a question there at the back, a chap in a blue shirt. Yeah.
My name's Anthony Bainbridge. I'm a graduate of member of Churchill College, matriculated in '64. I'm an electrical engineer, or was. As somebody said, I've had 2 or 3 different careers. I had a question and a challenge, really. The challenge is, why has it taken so long for us to get to the situation we're in now, where we have a splendid platform of 6 telling us what their life has been like? Should we have a platform of 6 elderly men telling us why it took so long for us to do things which enable this to happen? I wish we'd... When I was an apprentice on the shop floor in the 60s, the women were those who came in and cleaned up after us in the evenings, or wheeled tea round on the trolley during the day. Even when I was here, and from 64 to 69, women were mainly the wives of the founding fellows and a few wives of postgraduates who lived in the flats up the road, but they were, or a few girlfriends who eventually chucked me out for very wise reasons of their own. But again, they were exceptional. Since then, I have taught large classes of undergraduates at universities, and the sheer delight with which I find myself teaching a room full of, say, 80 undergraduates, roughly 50-50, male, female, and find the way they strike sparks off each other, and thereby, I hope, augment for themselves the woefully bad teaching that I give them. That's so hugely important that I wonder why we missed it for so long, for heaven's sake. So that's a challenge. But an observation since then. Recently, I've been involved in supporting 2 sixth formers, 1 male, 1 female, both at fairly prestigious private schools in their sixth forms, who wanted to apply to Cambridge. And neither of them, this is in reference to the career issue you were talking about earlier, neither of them were receiving from the career teacher, or whatever the title was in the school, anything like the appropriate advice on how to apply to Oxbridge, if so be you were ambitious enough to do so. They were kind of left on their own, seeking advice from family and friends, and seeking advice with their personal statements and so on and so forth. I think there is a woeful gap, not only in careers at the level you've been talking of it here, but also at schools. Teachers, by and large, it seems to me, don't have the kind of life track themselves, which enable them to be good advisors to those coming on behind them.
Okay, so just let me ask the panel on the first challenge. Any thoughts on why it's taken the men so long? Go on then, Belinda.
People like them. That's one thing. Despite the research evidence that more diverse groups make better decisions.
I think in the science and engineering world, the careers are still very diffuse, and certainly academic careers have their own sort of clear moves, but in business they're much less clear. But when you look at the legal and medical professions, I mean, women have exploded into positions of responsibility, and I think it's my sense is because the qualifications and the nature of that has two things: the careers are slightly more flexible, and secondly, the qualifications have given them professional standing. Whereas, although we're all in professions, we actually have to argue our case day in, day out. There's no badge that says that you deserve this kind of recognition.
I think it's because the costs of not having done it have been hidden.
That's a good point.
It's because one of the things that's interesting comparing companies and academia, I think, is that businesses have incentives to hold on to staff, for example, because it's expensive if you have to keep replacing staff, for example, right? In academia, nobody moves. I'm in the process of moving university at the moment. No one knows what to do with me because no one's ever met an academic, really, that does that. It's very unusual, right? So universities, for example, don't really have a pressure to... it's not, if there was a terrible environment, in any other business, their employees would all leave. And so there isn't that pressure. So the cost is sometimes hidden of not doing it. And if there traditionally haven't been women, then nobody knows what the benefits are. That's the other thing. So, better late than never. And, of course, on the scale of human history, these changes are happening quite quickly, never as quickly as some of us would like. But, things are changing from year to year.
OK, I'm going to try and get one last question in. Yes. Could you wait for the mic? If the mic could come down here, only so that everybody can hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to add to what Helen said, presumably quite a lot to do with the decision at the time was that it came on the back of the great raft of liberal legislation in 1968-69, all those great big acts about equal opportunities, sex equality and so on. It must have been part of that. Is that right? Anthony, you were there. Where is it?
Okay.
Can I comment on the
yeah, of course. Lisa, just come back to the careers advice, then we'll try and slip one last question in and we'll draw it to an end after that.
Just to comment on the gentleman's point about careers advice in schools, it is very varied and there's lots of stereotypes that are still portrayed actually within schools, and as a consequence of this, the university in particular, Cambridge, has made a very positive decision 5 or so years ago to actually be more open about its admissions process and to publicise that admissions process. So any individual student now can access the information through the internet on the admissions process and what to... So the university itself is providing direct advice, because the issue is word of mouth is a dangerous thing. Chinese whispers tends to happen. And even students actually that were successful in gaining places here actually don't necessarily have the right information about how the admissions process works. So we'd rather give it to the students straight from the horse's mouth. So there is a lot of work going in now to making sure that all schools are properly informed about admissions here in Cambridge.
Great, that's good to know, and glad gave you the opportunity to say it. So it'll have to be quick answers as well, but is there one last quick question that anybody would like to throw at the panel? Okay, okay, yes, and it must be a question, if you don't mind, not a kind of heaven forfend peroration or observation,
yeah, it's a question
as interesting
to
as those have been, yeah.
Do you see the possibility that we will have more entrepreneurial education in schools as well? Or do you think it's already there?
Like, who wants to crack at that?
I guess.
Oh, definitely.
Go on, Belinda.
We've certainly got it in our policy document that went through conference last week for financial literacy. I think that was your question, wasn't it? Yes, because that's absolutely vital. Along with relationship education. I know there'll be a more sort of social panel this afternoon, later on this afternoon. But relationship education is also vital for people to recognise when relationships are highly unequal or dangerous or abusive. But certainly financial, I mean, that's also in our policy document that it comes into. the school curriculum, but financial literacy is vital so that people can understand how to read, you know, how they understand just the mortgage payments that they're making, APRs, and how the different types of interest vary, because that has a huge impact on people's lives.
Okay, we'll take Anne and then Ottoline.
There is better. It is better. There's a thing called Young Enterprise that works in the school system that helps people start up small companies during their high school period. It's not enough, not even remotely enough. It's sort of it's outside the curriculum, and it's a bit like the chess club. You know, you join if you kind of know that it's there and you'd like to do it. Whereas I think your question is directed at getting entrepreneurial thinking more embedded into the entire population, and there it needs to get into the curriculum as opposed to just into the clubs. So I think there's a lot more that could be done.
And last word to Ottoline.
Gosh. So I think, very briefly, the most important thing that education can give you is confidence. That's not misplaced confidence, but confidence and the skills to go with that. And that's the same for education, for you know, for your career, moving forward, all those kinds of things. And that's something which I think Cambridge can do and the school system can do if we focus really on the joy of learning really interesting stuff and how you find out about it and how you apply it and how you take it forward, and less on how many points you have. Thank you.
Well, we started on an up, we've ended on an up. In fact, it's been up all the way along as far as I've been concerned. I've learned a heck of a lot. I hope you have. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panellists here for their insights. Very good. Thank you. And I'd like to...